Hi, and welcome back to the Why Eating Healthy is Not Enough Summit. I'm Linda Mechner, your host, and I'm here today with Dr. Anna Garrett, who is a pharmacist. Anna, do you want to say a few words about where you're coming from?
Sure. You might wonder why a pharmacist is on a summit about eating healthy, but I work with women who are going through perimenopause and menopause, and estrogen dominance, which is something that shows up in full force in perimenopause, is a huge cause of weight gain for many women. And so that's the reason you have a pharmacist who is an expert in hormones on this summit.
I think that's fantastic. I think a lot of people don't think about hormones. They think about eating healthy, they think about exercise, and forget that there's this whole other layer of what's happening in their body at different periods of time in their life. And so what are some of the symptoms that somebody might experience with estrogen dominance?
Well, can I start with what actually happens to the hormones first, and then I'll talk about how that manifests.
Perfect.
So when you enter your mid to late 30s, the likelihood is that you begin to ovulate less frequently. It doesn't mean that you skip periods necessarily, but you release an egg less frequently, and that causes your progesterone levels to go down because that egg is what ends up producing the progesterone. And progesterone is the hormone that counteracts the effects of estrogen. So estrogen tells your tissues to grow, which is why you get breasts and uterine lining and fat tissue. And the progesterone is there to counteract the effects of estrogen and keep it from just running wild, basically. And so when you don't ovulate all the time, you begin to have symptoms that are things like weight gain and breast tenderness and crazy periods and anxiety and insomnia. And these things just kind of come out of the blue, and women can really be blindsided by the effects of that small hormone change. And, things like anxiety and insomnia are very nonspecific. They don't, they look like a lot of other things, and women don't always have perimenopause on their radar screen if they have even heard of perimenopause. So that's how that estrogen dominance shows up for most women.
Interesting. It's so interesting. And I am in the thick of perimenopause myself. And sometimes I feel like, oh, this is no problem. This is a cakewalk. And other times I feel so blindsided, like, what is going on? This is so unfair. What did I do to deserve this hell? And then I will feel great for a while, and then I'll feel like I can hardly get a good day in a month. And actually that gives me a lot of insight, just, if I'm ovulating or not ovulating, can have a real effect. And, it's interesting. I've been taking some herbs for a while, and I had stopped, and then I went back to them, and that seems to be helping.
What are you taking?
I'm taking Vitex.
Yes, I recommend that a lot.
Yeah, and it really has helped a lot.
Good.
But, still there's some days that my breasts are, and I've never been one to really struggle or suffer with periods. And now it's just perimenopause is throwing me for a loop.
Well, and that's why I wrote my book. I have a book called Perimenopause, The Savvy Sister's Guide to Hormone Harmony, and that just came out this past spring. And I wanted it to be a resource that was sort of like what to expect when you're expecting for perimenopause, because, we got pregnant, we all went out and bought that book, and it was sort of like the Bible of how that experience was going to go. And so what I tried to do was recreate something similar for the perimenopause end of the spectrum.
That is so, so smart. And I'm going to get that book.
I like it. Here it is. This is what it looks like if you need to go get it.
Awesome. And so at what age does perimenopause start for women on average? I know it varies, but.
Well, the average length of that period of time is 5 to 10 years, and the average age of menopause is 51. So it can start early to mid 40s, but there are some women who actually go into perimenopause in their mid to late 30s. And so part of my mission in my business is to have women get that on their radar screen so that if these changes start to happen, they aren't thinking that they're just going crazy. But I would say that most women are probably in their early 40s.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I guess I'm hitting it late then, because I'm a little.
I did too. I didn't fully go through menopause till I was 59. So just this year.
Oh, wow.
So I'm on the other end of the bell curve, but there are women who are also on that really early end of the bell curve.
So you got to write the book from the experience of going through it.
That's why I started my whole business, because it's like, I am my client. So why not, work with women who are in the same boat that I am?
Right, right. And so what can women do to help themselves go through a smooth and easy perimenopause?
Well, there are several things that are lifestyle related. So number one is, if you're having issues with a lot of issues, try cutting out alcohol first, because that can make a huge difference in how you experience perimenopause, especially if you are somebody who has a lot of issues with night sweats and hot flashes. Second thing is, make sure you're sleeping, because sleep is the time when our bodies are allowed to restore our hormone balance and that kind of thing. And, a lot of people say to me, well, Dr. Anna, if I could sleep, I would, because that's a big problem in perimenopause. And I understand that, but a lot of women don't even give themselves the time container to get a decent night's sleep. So at least try to carve out enough time that you're at least resting, even if you're not fully asleep. And then dietary changes, cutting out sugar can be huge. Eating clean, unprocessed foods, grass-fed meats, things that are grown close to the ground, preferably organic, because a lot of pesticides act like estrogen in our bodies, and that just compounds the problem. And then the hormones that are found in meats can also compound the problem.
Right. And I imagine dairy products.
Yes, dairy products too.
Interface with that.
Yes, very much so. So those are just three, simple. I mean, some people would say giving up alcohol is not simple, because that's their management strategy for perimenopause. And that can be hard for some people. Caffeine is another thing to consider, especially if you notice that it makes you feel wired and anxious. It's hard on your adrenal glands. And so I generally recommend giving that up, even though there's some data that shows that caffeine can be good for our health.
Right. So this part about sleep is really interesting. I live in wine country. And so for a lot of people, their sleep strategy includes a bottle of wine.
Yes.
And if I say, well, cut back on the wine, then they're not sleeping.
Right.
And so maybe you could say something about some ways to get better sleep that are not reliant on alcohol. And then sleep aids are the other thing. And from my understanding, when you're using an artificial sleep aid, you're not getting the same quality of sleep. So you might think you're asleep,
right.
You're not getting the benefit of the sleep.
Right. It's better than nothing, but the truth is that sleep aids like Ambien and whatever, there's a whole universe of those, but really only add, I think it's 40 minutes to the amount of sleep that you get, and it's not REM sleep and it's not restorative sleep. So, and they're incredibly hard to get off of. As a veteran Ambien user, I can tell you that it took me a year to get off of that. So
wow.
I generally recommend not going down that road if you can avoid it. So a bottle of wine, yes, it'll put you to sleep, but you'll also wake up in the middle of the night. Alcohol does several things. Number one, it raises your estrogen levels, and estrogen levels that go up also will come down. And so that's where night sweats and hot flashes come from. And then it also affects your blood sugar. So raises your blood sugar, because alcohol is refined sugar. And again, blood sugar falls in the middle of the night, and that wakes you up as well. So there are several things that I like to recommend for sleep. The first is magnesium. And I like that because it is a calming mineral, and it's something that our soil has become very depleted of, so it's harder to get it in food. And it can be a real game changer for a lot of people as far as getting good restful sleep goes. I'm also, with supervision, a fan of progesterone. So there are two ways to do that. You can take it orally, which is a prescription, and you can use topical cream, which is over the counter. But it's possible to, do yourself more harm with the over the counter cream, especially if you have low cortisol, because it can actually make your sleep worse. What else do I like? I like adaptogenic herbs. So ashwagandha is one of my go-tos. It helps balance cortisol out. And then if I have test results that show me that somebody's cortisol is rising at night when they go to bed, there are other approaches that we can use to lower that so that it's not keeping them awake. So it really just depends on what the situation is.
Right. And I think that, you're mentioning testing, I think is so important, because sometimes people try to guess. They hear what their friend did and they want to do it, or they read a study about the effectiveness of something, but what they forget to realize is that they might not be the typical person, right? Because when you do a study, you're looking at everybody. You're not looking at any body, right? Any single.
Exactly.
And so do you do testing with your clients?
I do. I use the Dutch test, which is a dried urine test. I, in some cases, also do some blood spot testing, which is basically a finger stick. And again, that depends on the situation. A lot of physicians will tell their patients, oh, don't do hormone testing because it's not useful and hormones are changing all the time. And I mean, the truth is any lab test is a snapshot in time. And so to say that hormone testing is not useful, I think does women a disservice, because even if they're changing, I can still see the magnitude of the imbalance of estrogen to progesterone. I can get an idea of what testosterone levels are. I can see what the cortisol pattern looks like during the day. And so it provides a lot of useful information. And the thing about the Dutch test that I really like is it also allows us to see how the body metabolizes those hormones. So what is happening in the pathways that are used to eliminate the hormones from the body, and do those need to be tweaked in some way to make sure that the hormones are being eliminated properly. So with estrogen dominance, there's a supplement called DIM that I recommend quite a bit. I also don't recommend just grabbing it off the shelf and using it, because you can make yourself worse. But it forces, this is just one example of how this works, is it forces the estrogen into the safest pathway for elimination, and cuts down on any of the metabolites that are potentially associated with breast cancer. So there's a lot we can look at and manage without drugs that does a lot of good for people.
It's so exciting to hear about that. I mean, I think about estrogen dominance, and I've, in the testing I've done, I've never been in that, but when I was having all of these crazy perimenopausal systems, I was thinking, okay, am I in estrogen dominance now? And I started to really worry. It's like, because my boobs were just getting gigantic, and I just felt like in the space of a few days, I felt like I gained 10 pounds.
Yeah, exactly.
And I just and everything hurt. But to know that there's specific testing and specific supplements that can help people manage that is really exciting to me. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about estrogen dominance, because I think this is something that, I mean, even as a health coach, I mean, I'm not a pharmacist, I'm not a doctor, that's not really my world. And I'd love to understand more about that.
So, it really is fairly simple. So it basically happens when, I wish I had a slide that had what a normal cycle looks like.
We could pop it in here for people to see.
In a normal cycle, at the beginning, all of your hormone levels are low, and then your estrogen rises and your progesterone stays pretty low. And then you ovulate and your estrogen comes down a little bit and progesterone starts to rise. And so what is supposed to happen in the second half of your cycle is that progesterone becomes higher than estrogen and counteracts all of the effects of estrogen.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's in case you get pregnant, because progesterone is the hormone that helps you maintain pregnancy. So if you do become pregnant, your progesterone levels go sky high. But if you don't, then progesterone begins to drop off, and that's what signals your body to have a period. And meanwhile, estrogen's kind of over here hanging out below progesterone. Well, if you don't ovulate, you don't have any progesterone, or you have very little, that rise in the second half never happens. And so estrogen just kind of cooks along, and it's stimulating the growth of your uterine lining, and it's making your breasts get bigger, and it's causing bloating and all of the things that are typically associated with estrogen dominance. And so you have two choices. You can either raise progesterone or you can lower estrogen. And so if you are in the middle of perimenopause, you probably have a ton of estrogen dominance symptoms, because women who are on the beginning end still ovulate probably fairly often. If you're in the middle, not so much. And then if you're close to menopause, rarely at all. But in that period of time, your estrogen levels have begun to come down because you're heading toward menopause.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're in that middle part, that's when all the fun is happening. So, I mean, it really is that simple. It's just about the balance of those two hormones. Okay. But if you add stress in, then cortisol, which is one of your stress hormones, can actually block your progesterone receptors. So even if you have progesterone on board, it's not going to work because it can't get where it needs to go. And then the other thing that happens is when you have estrogen dominance and your estrogen is super high, it blocks your thyroid receptors. So it can make you feel like you have hypothyroidism, which is, sluggish feeling, constipation, cold feeling, hair loss. And your thyroid labs will look perfectly normal, but what's happening is the estrogen is blocking your thyroid receptors, and that hormone can't do its job. So it's all very intertwined. And that's where, working with somebody who does some testing and is an expert in all of those relationships can be really helpful, instead of heading to the Whole Foods and, picking things off the shelf and creating your own little concoction that may or may not do you any good.
Right. Or chocolate, which, a lot of people, they feel, PMSy or whatever you want to call that, and they go for the chocolate.
Right. Exactly. Or the sugar. I mean, it's like, the sugar cravings in perimenopause are just off the charts.
Yeah.
And again, that adds to weight gain as well. So
right.
It's a perfect storm.
I think it is so incredibly helpful and valuable for you to explain it so well, which you really did. And there is this stress piece, which I think, it's easy to discount stress. A lot of women think, well, I don't have a choice. I have to go to work. I'm taking care of my mother. My children are struggling. I'm supporting them. And meanwhile, they're dealing with their whole, what's going on in their bodies, and they don't, the connection of how all that stress is affecting them physiologically is not fully comprehended. I mean, and not to say that they would automatically know what to do about it, but even recognizing it.
Well, and my personal opinion is that stress is at the root of almost all hormone imbalances. I mean, yes, there are production problems, but, in third world countries where the stress is of a completely different kind, they don't have issues with perimenopause. I mean, there are some societies that don't even have a word for it because it just doesn't exist. And in the developed countries where they're very industrialized and we run around like chickens with our heads cut off, we are flooded with cortisol all the time. So that contributes to inflammation. Your body is going to make cortisol at the expense of all of your other hormones because it has to have cortisol to live.
Right.
It doesn't need all of this other stuff to live. And so if you look at the hormone production pathway, there are basically two sides of it. One is progesterone to cortisol. The other one is the other sex hormones that get produced from pregnenolone. And if you're under a lot of stress, that whole right side shuts down and you don't make sex hormones very effectively. And it just creates all kinds of havoc. And so, it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I can say, no, I'm not going to do that, but thank you for asking. because no is a complete sentence. And sometimes we have to take care of our bodies so that we can take care of everybody else around us.
Yeah. So
and really understand our priorities.
Absolutely. So how about, what tips could you give our listeners for working with their practitioners and healthcare providers?
Well, I would say one tip is to keep a journal of your symptoms, because that can be very helpful to help your provider pinpoint exactly where in the month your issues may arise. I would say do a little background research on what the options are. So providers are very quick to pass out birth control pills and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. And you need to know whether you as the patient are willing to entertain those options or not. And so one of the things about my book is I kind of lay out what the options are so that people can look at that and go and decide, maybe I would rather go this route rather than that. And, be honest with your provider. There are so many people that come in. I mean, people tell me stuff all the time. I must look fairly harmless, but there are a lot of people who will show up at their doctor's office and they'll get 6 3/4 of the way through their 7-minute visit, and they won't talk about the thing that is really bothering them the most. So the doctor's got his or her hand on the door getting ready to walk out of the room, and it's like, oh, by the way. And that is never a good thing from a provider standpoint. You don't want that to happen, because you want to take care of what's bothering people the most. So make yourself a list, prioritize it. If you need a second set of ears, take somebody with you to your visit. And I say do some background research, and what I want to really say is don't go too far down the rabbit hole, because it's very, very deep and you can end up scaring yourself to death. So, I'm always open for questions. So if people want to email me, as long as it's not something that's specific to their medical situation, I'm happy to answer general questions.
Oh, that's super generous of you. And what would you say are maybe one of your top tip or 2 or 3 for people who are in perimenopause, just to, to like how they can be their best advocates, their own best advocates? I mean, keeping a journal, I guess, is one, but in terms of diet and lifestyle, and what are some of the most important actions people could take?
So stress management is huge. So if you don't have a stress management practice, start one. If you don't know what that means, you can email me. But things like meditation or walking in nature, just giving yourself some space to breathe is so important for helping maintain balance. And then I would say, if you have dietary issues that need to be cleaned up, especially sugar, start there, because there is really no downside of trying to get rid of sugar. It's inflammatory. It plays havoc with hormone imbalance, and it's a great place to start. And I know it's not any fun to hear, but it's the truth.
Right. I know it tastes so good, and yet it's just so not good.
But the thing is if you can give it up for 2 weeks, it doesn't even taste that good after that. It's so sweet that a lot of people are just really turned off by it and go, yeah, I'm not missing anything. So
yeah, I've actually given it up periodically through my life. And recently I gave it up for 1.5 years. I did not have one bite of sugar. And then when I had something with sugar in it, it just didn't taste as good as I remembered. It just didn't light me up the same way. It just was not all that.
Because your brain is no longer getting that dopamine hit from the sugar.
Right.
It's moved on to some other reward. And so it's like, it's no big deal anymore.
Exactly. And how about, I know you have a free gift for our listeners. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'm offering the first chapter of my book as a free gift, a free download. And I'm sure the web download will be shared somewhere.
Yeah.
So that's what I have for you guys. I also have on my website a really quick Am I in Perimenopause quiz that has, I think it's like 10 questions. It'll help you kind of dial in where you might be in the process. So it gives you a score of 0 to 7, 7 being like, yep, you're there. And then there's a video series that comes after that that tells you what steps you can take to begin to manage wherever you are in the process.
Oh, how fantastic. How valuable.
And it's
Well,
easy.
yeah, well, that's always a plus too, because we're also busy and stressed.
Right.
Right?
2 minutes or less.
Nice. I like it. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. What you have brought is so incredibly valuable. I know it's going to be a real eye-opener for a lot of women and a real game changer as well. I know for me, I learned a lot, and I thank you so much.
Well, and thank you for having me. I was pleased to be invited. So I hope this was helpful for everybody.
I'm sure. Absolutely. All right. Thank you. All right. Bye, everybody. We'll see you
Take
next
care.
time.